Hello everyone, this is Nathan P. Butler. Welcome to the channel if you haven't been here often, or welcome back for those who are here regularly. I want to ask you a question here. Where were you 20 years ago? Or scratch that, more importantly, who were you 20 years ago? I've been thinking about that question with myself quite a bit lately. And not just because of being a parent, I really kind of had a chance for that type of introspection about 6 years ago when my son was born. But just thinking about where things were for me 20 years ago has been on the mind recently because of a 20th anniversary that is arriving this year. It is the 20th anniversary of when I wrote for Star Wars Tales. The one time I had a chance to create something for that fictional universe that was an actual narrative story. I got to dabble a little bit later, like doing some dates for the dated battle maps in the Essential Atlas, but the one chance to actually write a story within the Star Wars continuity of the time, the Legends continuity, and sort of how that affected things afterwards. And ironically, I don't think this was intentional by any means, in the way that Marvel Comics has planned out reprints of Dark Horse material over the years. It turns out that here in October of 2024, in what is basically the 20th anniversary month of the release of my story in Star Wars Tales 21, Marvel Comics has just reprinted that story for the first time in, I believe, 15 years, at least in physical print. So I'm kind of waxing nostalgic a little bit, thinking back on that, and I thought that maybe I should take a moment to sort of do something I can only do once, which is a 20-year sort of brief retrospective looking back on that opportunity and what came from it, and why, especially today, I'm still humbled and grateful for having had the opportunity. You may have seen on the channel before that I was very, cognizant at the time of this being sort of a once-in-a-lifetime thing and making sure that I sort of documented everything. I do still have, usually up in the closet, the binder, as it was called in one of those old From the Archives episodes here on the channel, that has all kinds of stuff from the process of writing the story. So, for those who are not familiar with it, the story that I wrote is called Equals and Opposites. It appears in Star Wars Tales number 21, and it stars Kyle Katarn and Jan Ors. Basically, they are on a planet called Ord Sedra, and they are in the process of having just gone to meet with the Imperial leadership. This is within the Force Heretic era of the New Jedi Order stuff, so shortly after Remnant. And they're going out, they're in Imperial space, they're on their way back, and they get a distress call from a planet where basically the Peace Brigade is rounding up people and handing them over to the Yuuzhan Vong. The Peace Brigade being the sort of collaborator figures, if you're not familiar with the New Jedi Order, Yuuzhan Vong being those extragalactic invaders and all that. And Kyle and Jan wind up there to try to essentially help save these people. And in the process, we wind up seeing them confronting the Yuuzhan Vong with some action pieces and whatnot. But also, we see Kyle and Jan kind of dealing with their relationship to a degree because of reasons behind the scenes that I will detail momentarily. But suffice to say, they are not married at this point. Kyle certainly wants to be. Jan wants to be, but Jan is resistant to doing so in a time of war and rather wants to wait until it is a time of peace where they can get married for the right reasons, not because of a pressure of not knowing what tomorrow will bring. So this all culminated in this 14-page story in Star Wars Tales 21 back in October of 2004. It was released as part of that product line as a regular sort of art cover, and as was the case with all the Star Wars Tales issues at the time, also a photo cover. Then in 2006, it was collected, as was typically the case, with 3 other issues. So it's one story out of 3 in the original comic, because it was an anthology, and then one of many from 4 different issues here in Star Wars Tales Volume 6 in 2006. Then in 2009, it was presented by Hasbro with just my story reprinted with a similar cover inside what's referred to as a Star Wars comic pack, which brought a unique single story version of the issue and also brought a new Kyle Katarn action figure, which is the second ever after this one back in, I believe, 98 or so. And it also brought the first full-blown Yuuzhan Vong action figure at the time. That was 2009, and then, of course, everything changed with the rights later on, with the reboot and everything, going over from Dark Horse to Marvel. Marvel did reprint Star Wars Tales 21 and such as a digital comic back in 2015, but hadn't put it out in print until actually this month. Here in October of 2024, we've gotten this. Part of that Star Wars Epic Collection product line. This is the New Republic Volume 8. It is primarily the comic series Star Wars Invasion, but because it's covering the New Jedi Order era, sure enough, there's my equals and opposites collected near the end of the book. It's surreal seeing my name in print for Star Wars again. So 20 years ago, who was I? Gosh, the word punk isn't right, but it feels so it feels so close. So 20 years ago, I am, I guess, a 24-year-old guy who grew up in Indiana and had moved to Atlanta, or the Atlanta metro area, to start a teaching career just 2 years before, so only 2 years out of college. I had been doing my first Star Wars podcast, which was started when we just called it internet radio, because podcasting just wasn't a thing as a term at the time. But I've been doing my show Chrono Radio for 2 years at that point. I have been doing my Star Wars Timeline project, which eventually became the Star Wars Timeline Gold, for 7 years at that point, which felt like a long time. I had no idea I would go on to do the timeline for about 20 years and podcast for about 18, not counting Patreon, even more than that counting Patreon. But I was relatively young. I was a big Star Wars fan. I was fired up. I was excited, and I was very passionate about what we were seeing. I was putting out content again through the timeline, through the podcast. My team and I, along with Chris Hannell, had put together the first serious Star Wars fan-made audio drama, Second Strike, that released initially at the end of 2002, and then a couple other acts in 2003. Very heavily into that sort of fan audio space at the time. And I, like so many others, these days especially, found that there was an audience to be found, or audience reaction to be found, in extremity, in sarcasm, in what I'd like to say these days is wit, but back then I'm not sure was witty enough to be called wit, mixed in with that passion. And I had done an episode of Chrono Radio, my first podcast, or whatever you want to call it, basically calling out Dark Horse Comics because they were screwing up a lot. Dark Horse was not able to meet their target release dates for hardly any of the comics in quite a while. And alongside that, there were a lot of proofreading errors in the comics, like stuff that a human would catch or should catch, but maybe an automated spell checker would not, like B for buy, right? Like not may the force be with you, but may the force buy with you, so to speak, that kind of thing. And just other issues that were happening along those lines. And I called it out in an episode that wound up being a bit of a rant, a bit of a tirade on it, leading to this idea that, you know, if Dark Horse can't get their shit together, the license needs to go, etc. Now that got some attention from those who were already listening to the show because they found it interesting and they just enjoyed the fiery commentary. But it also caught the eyes of, I believe, Dave Land at Dark Horse at the time, who brought the episode to the Dark Horse Comics forums, where, of course, the attitude was, can you believe this a-hole? Listen to this guy. And, you know, of course, the piling on begins on the forums. Randy Stradley not too happy with the opinions that I expressed either at the time, I believe. But then in comes young associate editor for the Star Wars product line, Jeremy Barlow. And his take seems to be more like, okay, the way he's saying it isn't great. It's bombastic, yeah. But he kind of has a point. We are missing these targets. We do have these issues going on with spell checking, and you know what? We are working on it. And he was the one who sort of reached out the olive branch to have a conversation about that. I don't think anything really of it until March 9th of 2004, when I get the following email, which I was allowed to quote back then, so I will still quote now. Hey Nathan, at the risk of compromising your status as a delegate for the loyal opposition, which is what I consider myself, right? Someone who loves something so much and you're so loyal to it that you are willing to stand up against when you see things that are going wrong with it to try to fix it, not to tear it down. I have a question for you. You interested in pitching a short in-continuity NJO story for Tales 21? I'm completely serious. If you're game, let me know and I'll give you some more details. If not, that's cool too. Just something a fella says, Jeremy. The subject line being a modest proposal, probably a play off of, I believe, Jonathan Swift and satire back in the day. Out of that comes a little bit of caution from me, kind of making sure that, if I did take them up on this offer, it wouldn't curtail my ability to still do the podcast or still do the timeline and that sort of thing. It's like, nope, it's just a straight work for hire kind of thing. Doesn't change anything with what you can say out there at all. You're not exactly a representative of the company or anything. You're just kind of doing the work for hire kind of thing. Let's do a 14-page story for Star Wars Tales 21. And this was a shock to me and a shock to others when they announced it. Because I had never written anything professionally before. Ever. Typically what would happen with Star Wars is that, one, you had to be invited to the party, as a saying used to go. You couldn't just say you were interested or send in like an unsolicited manuscript and say, hey, please publish this. See, I wrote a Star Wars story. None of that was okay. And generally speaking, to be invited to the party, you had to have some pedigree to your name as a writer. You had to have, maybe some non-Star Wars books published out there that went really well, or a writing style that has been established that they feel fits well within Star Wars, and so on and so on. I had none of that. I had never done anything of the kind professionally at all. But it was a unique moment, akin really to very few things, except maybe when they were allowing people to send in submissions for the official Star Wars Adventure Journal from West End Games when they still had the RPG license. And that was that this series, Star Wars Tales, had gone on for 20 issues, or would be 20 issues, and it was kind of wavering at that point. It was going to be canceled. It was billed as an anthology series that would include a lot of different Star Wars stories, quite a few in every single issue, but it became kind of a mess because some were in continuity, some were not, some were infinities, like what-if type stories, some were parodies, and initially, there was no label on it to indicate what would fit in continuity and not. Eventually, when they had the Infinities label created that was supposed to mark things as non-continuity or parody, they just slapped it on the entire thing, even though some stories were meant to fit. It was a mess. And it was going to be canceled. And Jeremy stepped in wanting to try to save it. And they gave him a year to basically revamp the series. It would probably still end after that year, but fine. Take a year, that's 4 issues quarterly, revamp the series into something different. What do you want to do? And what he decided he was going to do was cut down the number of stories per issue so they could be a little more substantial. Take the Infinities label off the entire thing, and instead label each individual story as to whether it was Infinities / out of continuity / spoof or whatever, or if it was in continuity, and if in continuity, what era would it be in, and in fact even note when it takes place within the comic itself, so it was easy to place chronologically. And they basically gave him carte blanche to do this, including bringing in whoever he wanted to write, which gave him the chance to give me an opportunity that, generally speaking, I would never otherwise have had. I am still, to this day, incredibly grateful to Jeremy for being willing to take a chance on me at the time. When asked why me, what he basically said was that it came down to essentially 3 things. 1, he wanted somebody who understood continuity as well, or perhaps even better, in his words, than him. And I'd been doing the Star Wars timeline for a while. It was clear that I understood continuity and how things fit together. He wanted someone who had a passion for this stuff and really cared about it. And despite the negative tone, perhaps, of that episode of Chrono Radio, that certainly shined through that I did care about it. And then someone who could tell a good story. And I don't know if he ever actually listened to Second Strike, that first fan-made Star Wars audio drama, that serious fan-made audio drama online. I don't know if he ever actually listened to it or just heard things about it, but the idea was that I could tell a story thanks to that. And that was what sort of led him to say, let's give this guy a chance. So basically there's an approval process, right? You do a pitch, and then it has to be approved at different levels through Dark Horse, which was, of course, through Jeremy. It had to go through Lucasfilm itself. Jonathan Rinzel, I believe, was doing all the approvals there, back and forth and back and forth. And then once you got a pitch, you're going to pin it down to a script. And that eventually needs to go to an artist, and the letterer, and the colors, and all these different steps of the process. And because I was brand new to it, he really took the time to guide me through and talk me through the entire process which was awesome to get a chance to actually see the process from the inside and not feel like, if I did any one little thing wrong, it's all over. So we had some pitches that went back and forth. Some were kind of dark, but the one that we kind of came around to was, it was going to be sort of like Luke and thinking about the New Jedi Order era, because we really want to kind of reintroduce that in comic form, because it had really mostly been the domain of the novels at that point for the New Jedi Order era. The Invasion comic series wouldn't come until much later. We wanted to do something with it to sort of reintroduce it. So we had sort of this idea of sort of a broader looking across the galaxy, Luke thinking about things, and then look, we're going to zoom in on this situation where Kyle and Jan are saving the day somewhere. So Kyle and Jan were part of that pretty early on. And then the thought was, well, let's cut it. If the meat of it is what's going on with Kyle and Jan, we've only got 14 pages, let's zoom in on them. And it became a focus on, how Kyle is very stylish, with the video game moves and everything like that, just being kind of overblown and exaggerated. How cool is that? So the idea that he's sort of a showman in that sense. So we had a pitch called Flair for the Dramatic at the time. And in the pitches, and the pitches go back and forth, you basically, not to put us too close to the screen so you can go to all the bits and pieces of it, but suffice to say you had black text, that was the stuff that I wrote. You had comments from Lucasfilm in red, comments from Jeremy in blue, and I would use that to refine it as I went. And one of the things that came up in that pitch process was that I referred to Kyle as being there to save the day with his wife, Jan Ors Katarn. Because in the Star Wars continuity at this point within Legends, as we're heading into the New Jedi Order, pretty much every prominent Star Wars couple had gotten married already. Luke and Mara, Han and Leia, and so on, members of Rogue Squadron pairing off and whatnot. It only seemed natural that these two who had been a couple for so long surely are married by now. We hadn't seen them in ages in any stories, so we don't really know what's going on with them, but surely the assumption would be, of course, they've gotten married just like all these other couples had. And for whatever reason, Lucasfilm, or LucasArts, I believe it was Lucasfilm, but LucasArts was consulted on the process, nixed it. No, they can't be married. Why? I have no idea. To this day, it's never been explained to me. But it started the ball rolling in my head of, oh, why aren't they married? And that got interwoven with that flair for the dramatic story, where it's not just about how, well, Kyle has this flair for the dramatic and Jan's all kind of sarcastic and kind of having fun with the fact that he's doing so, but instead this dramatic tension within the story of basically Kyle wanting to be married, to be the next Luke and Mara, as even the comic refers to, but that Jan is the one who's resistant to it. And to turn that into part of their playful banter within the issue. Thus, we refined the pitch again. It became equals and opposites, referring specifically to Kyle and Jan as equals and opposites. And at that point, you're kind of off to the races. You're writing a script, which is basically done by page, by panel. In this case, there's a lot of different ways you can write a comic script. They had me just give a very general description of what's going on and then the dialogue, and allow the artist to be the one to essentially interpret how to do the actual art, because let's face it, I am no artist. And the artist they wound up getting for this blew my mind, because it was James Reyes, the guy who at the time I knew of because I had been admiring his artwork for covers of the Transformers comic line at the time. Loved the guy's artwork. And he's the one that gets brought in to do the artwork for this story, with no suggestion from me. I was blown away by it. And eventually I start getting to see the artwork in its initial black and white form. They start sending that along. And then Michael Heisler is the letterer, and they have to start figuring out where the different balloons and stuff are going to go so he can start doing the lettering. So you start seeing stuff like this, where everything's essentially mocked up with a little numbered box where the different pieces of dialogue will go. Then the dialogue balloons start being laid out with the regular art. And again, I'm not going to show these too close to the camera. I don't want to show these in full just out of propriety, but I did get permission years ago to be able to show this stuff in behind the scenes materials. At the same time, Michael Attea was doing the coloring, and I started to see preview pages where it's sort of like a parallel process where on the one hand they're working on the dialogue balloons and everything, but on the other hand the colors being worked on, and eventually that'll be brought together until eventually the finished pages and then the finished product. And again, that product finally gets released in October of 2004. You have this version with a cover that's art by Lee, I believe it's Bermeo, is how you pronounce it here. 3 stories. You have inside a Nomad Chapter 1, Walking the Path That's Given by Rob Williams, and then by Shane McCarthy with Thomas Andrews, and then Equals and Opposites by yours truly. They're essentially in the back of the issue. Probably the most iconic image of the thing that people tend to think of when they think of this story is that one there at the bottom of Kyle leaping over saying, "Not likely," at that point. Keith Wood did a photo cover of the issue, which was this one here. Identical contents inside, but a photo cover. And then, as I said, eventually that would be included in a trade paperback, as was typically the case, which was Volume 6 of Star Wars Tales in 2006, which was this one with the Stormtroopers on the cover. Again, me way back in the very, very, very back. But again, cool to see my name in print and everything. I was all excited about that. And then I don't hear anything for a while. And at this point, things start to change a little bit. I get noted in our hometown paper, even though I don't live in my hometown anymore, which is pretty awesome. The issue does create a little bit of controversy within fandom who are aware of me at all, with the question of, why did this guy get a chance to write? If he was so critical of Dark Horse, why should he ever have been allowed in the door? And stuff like that, which is valid. But what I find is it starts opening a little bit of doors and calming me down a little bit. I was not to be any kind of official representative of Star Wars. I was work for hire. But I start to realize that maybe having actually had a conversation with Jeremy about the issues they were having, maybe it was better to have an intellectually honest conversation about the issues rather than letting it lean into hyperbole and fiery nature just to be able to be more entertaining. So slowly but surely, I find myself maturing as a podcaster and maturing as a host of various programs because of having that thought of, okay, I may not be representing it, but there's a responsibility that should come with this now to some degree. Also, I would say something that changed was that on various message boards, including the official site's forums, which is really the place to interact about Star Wars. And then, of course, there was also the Force.net's message boards were a big place for that, and GalacticSenate.com was a big place for that, where eventually I actually had a board for StarWarsFanWars.com. You get an elevated status on those places. On the official Star Wars message board, I became a purple person. The color of your name indicated sort of where you were in the hierarchy of different membership types, and purple people were VIPs, people who had an official connection. Suddenly that included me. And I can't say in any quantitative way how much, if at all, having written for Tales raised the profile of Chrono Radio, my Star Wars Timeline project, or anything like that. But I tend to think that a fair amount of people who became listeners or partakers, if that's the right word, of the timeline may have come to it because of me being, if not someone who wrote for Tales, but being a purple person on the official site's forums at that time. And I can say that spinning out of that, for me, a lot of stuff changed from this very small story that was such a big opportunity, because it, in a sense, it gave me confidence to feel like maybe someone might actually like something fiction that I wrote. At which point I did a podio book, as it was called at the time, like a podcast-based audiobook, and then a self-published version of a thriller called Echoes. And then one a little while later called Greater Good. It was a time travel type story. It was through those things and Tales that got the attention of Grail Quest Books. So when they were going to get the license from Decipher for Wars, the old trading card game, and relaunch a fiction line for that universe with some prequel stories, I was the one who was contacted to sort of be the Timothy Zahn of that universe to launch it at the time into this expanded universe. And then I got a chance to write for that a couple of times. That eventually gets handed off to Arcbeetle Press, and it is through Arcbeetle Press that those get republished, and I get an opportunity to have Echoes and Greater Good both professionally published. All the while, the attention on Chrono Radio helps me coalesce a podcasting community, a very small number of podcasts at the time. We didn't even call it podcasting for a long time. Coalescing around the site that I had set up as a hub for that community, StarWarsFanWars.com, that allows that sort of small genre to grow around it. and build an audience for me that lasted all the way through, I would say, Star Wars Beyond the Films and Cloud City Casino. The last podcast I was on before retiring from podcasting. And of course that stuff and the timeline spin off into doing the videos on YouTube, which lead to, from the Star Wars Library, then from the Star Wars Home Video Library, now Star Wars Home Video Year by Year that just launched, but also getting into things like having enough interest in the different collecting communities and getting enough of an audience to then make a Saga on Home Video, first edition and then second edition. So much of my fandom life, my hobby life, not really my professional life in the sense of teaching. I mean, my teaching career probably would have been the same. But so much of my fandom and hobby life since then, which is already in many ways being dictated by Star Wars, and the things I've been able to do, the opportunities that I have had, even in small ways, like writing for Movie Magic magazine about The Force Awakens when it was about to come out, all that kind of stuff really, I think, can be traced to this opportunity. And the fact that Jeremy Barlow was willing to take a chance on me, even when I had not been kind to the product line and the troubles that they were having. So anyway, spinning out of that, those get published in, again, 2004, 2006. A few years later, I find out, I believe through being pointed to it online, I can't remember who it was, maybe Jason Fry perhaps that did it, I honestly forget. Like, hey, guess what? They're making action figures. They're making a comic pack from your comic. What? I'm not notified officially at all, but what? That led to this in 2009. Special issue of the comic, Kyle and the Yuuzhan Vong figure, because they wanted an opportunity to do a new Kyle Katarn figure because they'd only had one before, and to make a new Yuuzhan Vong figure, that'd be cool, that'd be new. It's kind of why they would have chosen this particular story, not anything about me per se. But that gave us that, which has this special truncated version of the issue on the inside that is just my story and nothing else. Just that and advertisements, if you want to count that as something here. Probably the hardest to find variation of the comic. And then, years go by. I don't feel like I'm going to have any more opportunities to write for Star Wars. I do wind up being brought in to consult on the dates and create the dates for dated battle maps and whatnot for the Essential Atlas, including being to pin down on a digital calendar for the very first time ever the exact start date of Return of the Jedi, which is pretty cool. But beyond that, I don't expect anything to come out of it, and certainly I feel like those doors close once Marvel picks up the license. I just look back on it fondly as a fan, not expecting to see it again, because I didn't really expect Marvel to go back and do a lot of reprinting of old Legends stuff, especially not obscure little stuff. But sure enough, over the years they have, and as I said, this week, as of the time I'm recording this, they released Star Wars Epic Collection, The New Republic, Volume 8, with the Legends banner. Again, mostly Star Wars Invasion, but finally, Equals and Opposites is back in print, and it gives me a chance to celebrate this 20th anniversary, to kind of think back on the process, think back on this last 20 years. I am certainly not the same person I was 20 years ago. I would like to think that I have matured, that I'm a better fan and a better individual, a better educator, and a better host. But a lot of this last 20 years of my time in fandom and the things that I have done, really in a lot of ways, if they weren't directly caused by that opportunity to write for Tales, it certainly was shaded by it, colored by it throughout those 2 decades. So my thanks to those who supported me back then, especially when people were decrying the fact that I was even getting a chance to write at all. I appreciate you. My thanks to those who stuck with me over the years since then, perhaps drawn by that, and especially my thanks to the creative team, also behind the issue, James Reyes, Michael Atea, Michael Heisler, and of course, the man who brought me in and started the ball rolling in the first place, Jeremy Barlow, former associate editor of the Star Wars line for Dark Horse Comics. May the Force be with you all. I hope this may have jogged some memories for you. If you were someone who was, part of the listening circle, the viewing circle back then, I know it's brought back a lot of memories for me. Happy 20th anniversary, Equals and Opposites. Thanks for watching.